Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 60 of the Defend Your Ground podcast. This is Ben. I'm the executive director of Blue Ribbon Coalition. I am here with Simone, our policy director, and Nick, who's joining us for the first time. We've hired Nick to help us with a lot of our marketing needs, and so he's going to be a common fixture here on our podcast to help us move this along and make sure this becomes a good resource for educating people about the management of our public lands and what we need to do to keep them open. So, Nick, thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me. Super excited to be part of the team. Been following Blue Ribbon Coalition for quite a long time. Love what you guys have been doing. Been learning a lot, and I'm happy to help if I can.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. And Simone, my usual partner in crime. I don't know if we should call it that, but
Maybe we shouldn't say crime, but
no, we're not committing any crimes here. We're
partner
trying
in
to make sure
strategy.
our
We can say that.
a strategic partner in making sure we keep our public lands open. And you have an important issue for us to talk about today. Why don't you kick it off and tell us what you've got cooking right now?
Yeah, so a little bit different than what we normally do and what I normally do. Normally, we'll get on here and we'll talk about an issue from the Forest Service or the BLM usually, and we'll say, here's the proposal, and we need you to go submit comments on it. But today we're going to talk about CFRs. And I would assume that the average Joe CFR isn't
Good, an
in their
acronym.
in their daily vocabulary. So CFR is Code of Federal Regulations. And for those who don't know what the Code of Federal Regulations are, they are rules essentially that agencies have come up with. So how things started with our country is Congress is supposed to make all of the laws, right, that govern everything. Congress doesn't always like to make a lot of laws and put their necks out on the line. And so they have delegated some power to the actual agencies. So the Department of
Some
Interior,
power,
they've given way too much power to the agencies.
all their
Thank you for the
power.
correction. Yes. I mean, they'll
Yeah.
pass a law or two every now and then, but nothing in comparison to what the agencies do. Basically, somebody who's in the Bureau of Land Management, they are the ones that are writing these codes, these regulations, and it doesn't go through Congress anymore. I mean, Congress has no say. So you as the average American people, if there's something you don't like, you can't just go and vote these people out because this is their career. These are agency staff that have come up with these regulations, and they are what governs our public lands right now for the most part. I mean, we still have FLIPMA, that is a law passed by Congress that they say that they comply with, or at least attempt to comply with. But when you get into it, the nitty gritty of what is shaping public lands and these travel management plans, resource management plans, are these CFRs, these federal regulations that direct how they're being managed. And so these regulations are what are being used to justify closures, justify restrictions.
Can I ask you what is the legal standing or argument? Because obviously we're supposed to have, regulation by representation. But if Congress is giving the authority for these agencies who aren't elected to make these laws, how is that possible? Like, what is the legal argument or authority?
Well, that's actually changed in the last couple of years, which is interesting, which is why we're talking about it today. Because before, Congress did say legally, you guys can do this. We are giving these agencies all the power to make the decisions, to make these rules. But was it 2 years ago, Ben, that we had, was it
It was last
somewhere
summer
2
that
years
they
ago, or it was
overturned
just
the
last
Chevron
summer?
deference.
Okay.
Yeah, so and that overturned the Chevron deference was a legal doctrine where the courts kind of said we would defer to agencies when they make these rules that they're acting within a proper scope of their authority. And then if the agencies think that it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And so that got overturned last summer, which means it's a huge open-ended question of how much can an agency do when it comes to this rulemaking, which has become almost the default way that we get any sort of a new law in the country anymore. It's not through congressional action.
Because they don't
And it
have
also means
just
a lot of these
infinite deference to make these decisions after that court ruling. So we can scrutinize these regulations that the agencies have implemented now.
Yeah, and what was interesting about Chevron deference is it didn't really remove anything at the moment, right? They just said this doctrine is now no longer, we don't see it this way anymore at the Supreme Court. But it didn't mean that they then did a holistic review of all the federal regulations that were on the books to say, well, these now were upheld because of Chevron deference. They're no longer valid. They basically said everything that's still on the books is valid for now, but this new precedent is in effect. And so it kind of opened the door for what we see as a lot of new legal challenges. That's why we staffed up and hired an attorney to help us challenge some of these. If you read any of our lawsuits that we filed since last summer, they're raising this question of, does the agency have the authority to do what they're doing after Chevron deference got reversed?
And I have members asking me all the time, well, because of Chevron deference, we should be able to go do this, or they shouldn't be able to do that. But like Ben said, those things are still valid. It just opens the door for new legal challenges or for new opportunities to look at these regulations. And that's what the current administration is giving us right now. They're giving us an opportunity to look at these regulations because there's an executive order that for every new regulation that the administration is putting into place, they need to remove 10. But there's so many regulations. Do you have even an idea, Ben, of how many regulations there actually are, like how many CFRs there are?
I don't. I just know that the Federal Register usually publishes about 100,000 pages a year of new regulations. And so it's millions of pages of.
Yeah, there's so many regulations for them to look at. They still need us to help point them in the right direction. And the Department of Interior has actually opened it up and said, hey, we want to know which regulations need to be looked at, need to be amended or rescinded. And so they've come to the public asking for information. And at BRC, we have a long list of regulations that are used against us that we're going to give to them to look at because like we said, there's a lot for them to look at. And if our community doesn't make some noise about which ones to look at, they're going to get overlooked. There's just too many for them to review right now. And so that's what we need everybody's help with, is to sound the alarm on some of these that are the most problematic for public land.
Yeah. And so I do want to back up a little bit and talk about, everybody's seen Schoolhouse Rock, where we learn about how a bill becomes a law and it gets introduced in the House, and then the House votes for it and it passes, and then it goes over to the Senate and then it passes, and then the two houses conference the bill together and come up with a piece of legislation that then goes to the president's desk, and it's either vetoed or signed into law by the president. And that's how we get new laws in the country, and it's in the Constitution, and that's kind of how it's supposed to work. Well, the way we get a new regulation is that Congress passes a law through that process, the Schoolhouse Rock process. And instead of explicitly telling an agency what to do, they say, manage public lands and make sure that you manage them for multiple use, but also make sure you protect the scenery, and also make sure you protect the wildlife, and make sure you keep them open for recreation, and make sure you also let them be used for mining and a mineral use, and make sure you also leave them open for grazing cows and agriculture. And so they give them all of these conflicting mandates, but then don't really tell them how to do any specific one of those. And then they say, and go manage land, be reasonable, go manage the land. And so the BLM and the Department of Interior ends up in somewhat of a tough spot. But what they say is, well, we're going to enact a regulation. They'll follow what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, which means they do go take public comment, and it's published in the Federal Register. And that's why I say the Federal Register publishes hundreds of thousands of pages a year of new regulations, because Congress isn't doing anything substantive or specific. And so then the agencies are the ones pushing out all of these regulations. They carry the force of law. If you don't follow regulation, you can be penalized, you can be charged fines, you can go to jail. And so they are, in essence, laws. And so that's how we get new regulations. It's become kind of a default way of policymaking in the United States. Once those go into the books, that's how they start to manage things. And so what happened, like with the BLM, is they would say, well, the FLPMA, the Land Management Policy Act, says we need to protect or manage for scenic resources. So they'll create a whole regulatory scheme of how to make sure visual resources and scenery are protected. Now, Congress didn't really tell them to create that scheme. They didn't tell them how to do it. So they just kind of make it up. So that's how we get them. And sometimes we also get them from court settlements. We know that the Subpart C of travel management planning for the Forest Service, which is what governs all of the snowmobile plans that are coming out on our national forests, That was a result of kind of a legal settlement where the Forest Service says, hey, we don't have a great system for managing snowmobiles, so we'll create a whole new regulatory code scheme of how to do that. And they enacted it as a result of a
Input
lawsuit.
whatsoever.
Yeah, Congress never told them to do snowmobile plans. But Nick, you had a question. What's up?
Yeah. So you said that there is, when they do this, there's time for public comment. And is that the only way the public comment is when they're releasing hundreds of thousands of pages of these things? And
Yeah, I mean that's your moment to shine as a citizen, and we have done that. Like they wanted to do the natural asset company rule, which would have sold all the ecosystem services of our planet into a $4 quadrillion market on Wall Street that the SEC proposed as a rulemaking or a regulation. It was on page 68,211 of the Federal Register, and we happened to be reading the Federal Register that day and doing our daily reading of it. Realize, hey, this is a problem. We'd alerted our members about it, but yeah, it gets buried in that process. You do get to make a comment, which means you can influence how these come out, but ultimately that's all just box checking. If the agencies want to get these done, they will. I consider it a counterfeit form of public accountability. To make a public comment, I mean, we do it because it's what we have to do to preserve legal standing. The agencies aren't required to follow your public comments. They're just required to consider them. And
So
so
if
as
the
long as they read
majority
your public
opposed
comment,
one, yeah, if the majority of the
they could
public
still
comments
enact
opposed
the
to
rule.
regulation, they could still do it. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
But if that same majority opposed a law being enacted, a member of Congress that's in tune with the public would choose not to enact that law because they'd lose their next election. And so the public comment process isn't a good replacement for political accountability, where you can vote out the people who are making laws you don't agree with. But that's what we have. And it's grown. And it's not to say that we couldn't have any regulations at all. If Congress were to get more specific in its laws, it could probably direct agencies to create regulations that follow very specific directives, and they just don't do that in most cases. And so, really, the culprit here with why this is a problem in our system is the Congress. Like, that's like, who is the problem here? They need to do their job, and they need to do it a whole lot better than they've been doing it for the last 80 years. But that being said, to Simone's point, the Trump administration did release a new executive order, and it tells the agencies that if you want to enact any new regulations, and they do have to enact new regulations to enact the Trump administration's agenda and priorities. For every new one you create, you have to rescind 10 old ones. And so they've asked for public feedback on which CFRs, which regulations should be rescinded. And this is something we think every BRC member or supporter should take an active role in, because when we lose access to our public lands, it is most commonly because there are existing regulations that are being relied on by the agencies to shut things down. It's not usually references to specific laws and statutes. It's specific, they usually are referencing in their legal actions, the codes of federal regulations, their internal memorandum and decision memos and things like that, that are all built out of the regulatory apparatus of our government, not the legislative statutory apparatus. This is what when people say it seems like they always just close stuff and close stuff and close stuff, it always just seems to be closing more and closing more and closing more. The system is rigged to close stuff. The way it got rigged to close our public lands was through these regulations and their implementation. It wasn't because of laws that got passed. And so that's why we care a lot about this. We want to unrig the system, and that's what we're going to talk about, are the regulations we can be targeting right now. Nick, did you have a question?
yeah, do you have any examples, just like with all the closures that have been going down in the last few years, where they referenced a specific CFR?
You betcha. You bet we do. That's what. So today we have two that we've identified as what we think are the first targets of regulations that should be rescinded by the Department of Interior. Simone, why don't you pick one? What's your first one you want to start talking about? Okay, so designation criteria. What is it? So let's back up. So if you've heard us talk about travel plans in the past with the BLM, and you have, because we talk about these a lot. So we have the Labyrinth Rims Gemini Bridges Travel Management Plan, or the San Rafael Swell Travel Management Plan, or the Logandale Travel Management Plan. Like, we've probably done a few dozen travel management plans just in the last 4 years. And travel management planning is where the BLM looks at a certain area and says, what routes are we going to make available for the public to use in this area, and why? And Congress never told the BLM to do that. They never said, hey, create route networks and designate routes as open and closed. They didn't say you need to have this managed travel network and here's the criteria and how you do it. They just told the BLM, let's protect vegetation. Let's manage the land to protect the soils. Let's manage the land to allow for recreation. That's about as deep as they got in the statute. Yeah, and multiple use. And so the BLM came up with this whole process called travel management planning. And so, Simone, how long is the route evaluation criteria attachment on any given travel plan where they go through each route? 1,000 pages, 2,000 pages. I mean, San Rafael Swell is 2,000 pages because each route has, yeah, and there'll be 2,000 routes. And so these are these massive documents where they're now going through each route and then looking at the designation criteria of whether it should be open, closed, or limited to administrative use. And then it evaluates all the different things that they're supposed to be evaluating. And again, that's all built off of this regulation
that they wrote themselves.
And so it's really built on a paper thin statutory basis that we even do travel management planning at all. And it doesn't mean it wouldn't be a good idea to have some sort of process for doing that. But Congress should be the one who creates that process and defines how it should work, and then probably has ultimate sign off on what gets approved. Because in the case of Utah, none of the congressional delegation members support the travel plans that have been created by the BLM. None of them do. And so the BLM's used authority that was delegated to them questionably by the Congress to do something that would never get the support of the Congress. But now everyone's like, well, what do we do about it? Well, let's take them to court. And that's where it's a very broken system of government to be doing it this way. And so we kind of need the operating system to be upgraded to something where it puts Congress back in charge of these things instead of us working off this, whatever the agency. When was this OHV designation criteria, the travel management criteria? Do you remember when this one was implemented? Yeah. I mean, it was not any sooner than the 1970s. Maybe the early 80s. And so this stuff has been on the books for a long time. It was validated by the Chevron deference being adopted as a legal doctrine or precedent in the courts. But now that that's been overturned, this is a huge open question. Our San Rafael Swell plan raises concerns about these designation criteria. We are talking about this aggressively in our lawsuits. So when the Trump administration, when Trump won his reelection, we started getting word that they were going to be doing some deregulatory action, right? You had Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy wrote some opinion editorial in the Wall Street Journal where they talked about what Doge was going to come and do. And they cited Chevron deference. They said the Chevron deference really raised serious doubts around the validity of a lot of these regulatory regimes that are out there. And it is true that we can be questioning these and scrutinizing these in the courts, and we are, and we will continue to do that because this is going to require a full court press. But it's also true that an executive branch agency can rescind its own regulations. The same way that a regulation was created, it can be uncreated. These are kind of discretionary acts of the executive branch. And so there's nothing that says they have to be permanent. And they update these all the time, going back and forth between administrations on updating the regulatory codes that implement the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Protection Act. All of these have been redefined by at least the first Trump administration, and then the Biden administration rewrote them again, and then now they're all being rewritten again. Again, another reason why this is a terrible way to do government, because when Congress passes things, it usually is a lot more permanent because there's that political buy-in. If it has enough political support to have passed through the congressional process, you've created something that's going to be a lot more durable, and the only way to undo it is through congressional repeal, which is harder to do than passing something. Simone, name off the top of your head 5 laws that have been repealed in your lifetime. Nick, you should.
Don't ask me. I have no idea.
I can think of one that got repealed, not in my lifetime, but pretty soon within my lifetime. I'm not this old. The Homestead Acts were repealed when we passed the FLIPMA in 1976. They actually repealed the Homestead Act by passing a new law. So usually when we repeal things, it's because we've passed new things to replace them. We don't ever just like repeal something to be like, you know what? We don't need this act from 1782 anymore. Once Congress passes stuff, it stays pretty durable. If an agency passes a regulation, you're one election away from it all changing. And so it means that that's part of what makes it really difficult for these agencies to manage public lands.
And
That
so,
also, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
so you're saying the executive branch could just basically get rid of any of these CFRs, even though that the BLM, I mean, who was that created by Congress? I believe,
Yeah.
wasn't
And
it?
so the BLM was created by Congress.
But the executive still has authority over these regulations.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I mean, the Biden administration had a very aggressive regulatory agenda where they updated and it issued a lot of new regulations. So the landscape health and conservation rule, which created the plan to lease all of our public land to conservation groups, that was a rulemaking. And there was a CFR creation, like that created new regulations. And so the executive branch kind of has felt like it has pretty broad license to update these as it sees fit. And with the case of the landscape health conservation rule, it's kind of wild because here you had this law that had been in place, FLIPMA, since 1976. And the BLM in 2023 looked at that and said, you know what was hiding in plain sight in this law all the time was this authority where we can just go sell the conservation leases to everybody and make a bunch of money. And again, another problem because Congress is who has authority over like taxation and raising revenue for the government. For the BLM to use a regulation to create a whole new system for raising revenue for themselves, a huge constitutional bypass there. And so the designation criteria, that's regulation number 1. Simone, we're going to have an action alert linked in these notes where people can go and also share their feedback that they support this effort to rescind this regulation, correct? Is that what the action alert does? Yeah,
Who decides like and who decides like the levers or the metrics for each one of these different minimizations?
it's arbitrary.
This is completely subjective.
And ultimately, the fix for this is Congress needs to define what it means. So, if Congress wants the BLM to manage user conflicts on public land, that's great. Define what a user is, define what a conflict is, define those conflicts where if somebody's doing something, and you can do that, like if you are. So if you have a user that is like an oil and gas installation, right? And they've now acquired through a lease access to a 2 to 3 acre well pad where they have facilities and stuff. It would be a user conflict for some recreation user to come and access that facility's footprint and mess with their equipment, right? It creates a danger, it creates a liability. If something were to go wrong in that situation, we would have insurance companies and lawyers and police and people involved in that conflict. And so you create a trespass law and say, if you trespass on this piece of land that's set aside for this use, you're trespassing. And then you enforce a trespass. The trespass is the conflict. That's a violation. That's something that's documentable through a citation by a law enforcement agent. And that's definable conflict. Just having some user group out there be like, I don't like them, that's not a conflict. That's just somebody's opinion. And so you could solve the e-bike problem with this. Like the reason e-bikes aren't allowed on stuff is because they're saying that having this what they call a motorized use on a mountain bike trail is creating conflict. Well, it's not creating any documentable conflict. There's no citations. There's no one being injured. There's no damage to the environment that isn't being caused by other bikes. And so it's like Congress has to be the one that wrestles through all of this and says if there's a trail that's managed for multiple use, we know how to do this because we manage transportation systems all over the place. So say we're on a public highway on a road, who has conflict in a lane change situation when you have your blinker on for 3 seconds and you have, I mean, we have rules for how to manage those conflicts. Who has the right of way in a intersection and or a crosswalk? Like there's rules around that. You have rules over who gets priority of use on a certain area. And so that's what we do. Like with horses and mountain bikes and hikers that share the same trail, there are right of way rules that can be put in place that if you're a mountain biker, you must yield to the person on horseback. You know, that's how you codify user conflict into the law. And Congress could do that. And then if you are a mountain biker and you didn't yield to someone on horseback and then that person got injured, you now have a huge problem because you caused an injury to a person and you're now liable for that because you weren't following the right of way laws on that trail. And so it isn't just this way for one group to collectively amass its power and then subjectively ban another group from being able to use a public benefit. That's a completely perverted and wrong way of interpreting user conflict. But because we're doing it through this open ended regulation, that's how it's been interpreted now. Because as long as we can loosely define something as a user conflict that could rationally hold up in court, then they get away with it. Pre Chevron deference. I don't think they will very much longer. So, anyway, Yeah, so we had a very specific instance there, and it was a little bit more malicious than what you're describing, Simone. Is so in the San Rafael Desert, that was the first travel plan that we completed in this legal settlement where SUA had sued the BLM, required them to go through over a dozen new travel plans where they had to analyze over 10,000 miles of roads. The San Rafael Desert was the first one that got completed. And the BLM chose the OHV friendly alternative plan there, which still closed hundreds of miles of routes, by the way. The OHV friendly alternative did. And that was done by the, of course, it was. Yeah, it was why. And so the Trump administration was the one who released that plan first. And so SUA sued the Trump administration over that plan. So they didn't like it. They wanted a lot more routes closed in that area. And so while they were in litigation, you had administration change. And the new administration was the person who was like the interim director of the BLM at the time was Nada Culver, who was the lawyer for the Wilderness Society, who signed the settlement agreement. So she was very conflicted on this, like legally. But then once she takes control of the BLM, we get a decision out of the BLM that they use a categorical exclusion, which means they do bypass most form of public process and input. And then they used this CFR, which gave them an emergency declaration to close roads. And so they closed a bunch of the roads in the San Rafael Desert that they wanted to see closed through this legal settlement. And so they were pre-baking the outcome of a legal settlement by abusing this CFR. And so an appropriate use of this CFR would be like a time where I expected they might use it was when they found that weird obelisk thing out in Moab. And so all of a sudden you have the public flooding out there with traffic to an area where the BLM didn't analyze that much traffic to be going into that area. And now you have a ton of people coming into an area, affecting the resources there in a way they didn't anticipate or predict. They didn't have any management infrastructure in place to manage a huge crowd of people coming out to this area that now became a hot spot. That would be an appropriate use of this rule to say, hey, hold on, there's way too many people coming out here. We hadn't had planned for this. We're going to close it temporarily so that we can. What they did is they went and removed the obelisk, and now there was no reason for people to come out there. And then they could have reopened the road. Yeah, to fix the reason. Or if it was for something else to go put in barricades or do something to kind of keep people where we want them to be. And so it isn't that this rule wasn't solving a kind of a real problem, that there are times where, I mean, you could see instances in like wildfire or natural disasters or something where it's not safe for people to go into an area. So to temporarily close something to mitigate the impact, then you should have a rule to do that. But we saw them use this to basically close a bunch of routes that had a few weeds growing up in the middle center line of the route. I have pictures of these. I went out and documented some of these routes that they wanted. That there's 35 miles of additional routes that they closed through this emergency process, and they said if people were to go use these routes that were existing routes open through the current plan, that they would be causing damage to soil and vegetation. And that is an abuse of this regulation. And
So
if
the
they
emergency was that a weed was growing across the path.
and if we were to go use that route, somebody might run over that weed. That was 100%, Nick. That is 100% what it was. They said the right words in the categorical exclusion, and then they closed it. We challenged that closure, like, because we were defendant interveners on that plan. So we were saying, like, and this was done in secret. We're like, hey, wait a minute. This is materially changing what is currently being litigated in court right now. And then within weeks, it was like, well, there's a settlement anyway, and all these routes are going to get reevaluated now, and they're currently now closed for use. So we couldn't actually go out and evaluate the routes during the subsequent public process where they wanted to review these routes one more time. And then they ended up closing most of them permanently. And so this wasn't ever temporary. There, like, if I was Congress and I was looking at solving this problem, you could get political support to give the BLM emergency authorities to close routes. Like, that's reasonable. Put a sunset date on it. Give them a timeline. Codify the specifics of how this should work so it doesn't get abused. And that's what Congress has just become terrible at doing as the administrative state has risen to fill in the gaps. And it could do that. And then if they did that, then the BLM would have clear guidance. It's something that couldn't be manipulated by a politically motivated actor at the top of the agency to basically steer the outcome of a court action. And our concern here and our message to the administration of why this rule should be rescinded is this administration's priority is to open a lot of public land. And if they don't rescind these rules, this is how, if a new administration comes in that has a different agenda or priority, they'll use these rules to undo everything this administration did. And so if they do this now, and if they get these off the books early and put in place new programs, it'll be a lot harder for a new administration. It's not impossible, again, because these are still all executive actions. They can be redone by a future presidency. This is one that should definitely go because it's been abused, even though it started from a reasonable place. If it's been abused, get rid of it and make the Congress fix it. If we really need this, the Congress will fix it. But how it is currently written in 43 CFR 8341.2 is a problem. So they should rescind.
I mean, it makes total sense because, like you were saying earlier, we know that once the government does something, how often do they overturn it? So not having a mechanism in there for them to go back and say, okay, we need to reevaluate this. How do you ever get these overturned?
You didn't. They left this one in place until they were able to get something permanent done. It was a temporary closure that was designed from the outset to become permanent. And so they abused this law. If it would have had a 14-day sunset clause or something that says this closure's in effect for 14 days, and then it automatically reverts back to being open, and the BLM has 14 days to mitigate the impact, and then after the 14 days, if it needs to be closed longer, they need to initiate a NEPA process or something that's open to the public to do the permanent change, which is what they did here. But it should have reverted back to open before they went through something that would have, like, if the management assessment is that it needs to be permanently closed, then that should require more involvement. This is what's called a categorical exclusion, where they kind of bypass the public process that gives groups like BRC legal standing and the ability to go and challenge with teeth any permanent closure. And so the way they did this was just very manipulative and abusive. It just was. And so without some sort of hard-coded sunset clause, this rule could be used in the future to close down all kinds of things temporarily that never get reopened. So, Simone, if you're someone who agrees that the BLM shouldn't be able to permanently close our public lands through temporary emergency regulatory power, what should that person do if they agree with us that we should be opposing this? Exactly. And we'll be giving these to the administration officials in whatever way we can, but we want to show that it's not just us, that we're doing this on behalf of our members, and we have broad public support for this. And so do sign the petition. We want to show that there's a lot of support and that we're speaking on behalf of a large group of Americans who want to keep our public lands open. What were you going to say, Nick?
No, I was just going to say, and they're actively asking for this. They want to hear the feedback.
They want to hear from you, and that's why we're alerting you about this, because this is the kind of stuff that gets buried in a lot of the noise that happens around these kinds of issues. And so we consider this, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the grand reopening of our public land. And this is what it looks like. On one level, we do want to reopen a lot of the things that were closed. We've been having some success with that. We were out recently looking at a trail that got reopened in Glen Canyon. We have seen the conservation leasing rule was permanently rescinded. And we think there are some things in the budget bill that actually will permanently reopen some land. We want to see them get done first. And once those are done, we'll let you know what those are. But these regulatory, yes, unrigging. Yeah, if we can unrig the system now, it means anything that gets done in the next 3 years will be a lot more favorable for access and keeping stuff open. And so we have to unrig the system. And this is how we do it. This is how we can create an operating system that's hard coded to keep our public lands open instead of to close them. And yeah, so go sign the petition. Let's support this. And we're starting with these two. Simone, you've identified at least 20. at least, maybe more. 30, 40. I mean, we're going to be submitting a lot of these ourselves. Ones that we think have really broad impact and affect a lot of our users. We're going to educate you about those and have additional actions you can take to help support us in this. We feel like we have a couple weeks, maybe a couple months to really move the needle on this. And so we don't have time to wait. When you learn about this, make sure you help share it. Make sure you send it to your friends, share it on social media. Make sure your club members are supporting this. And this is one of the things we think will make the biggest difference in the coming years on keeping things open and reopening things that got closed. Anything else you want to add, Simone? I think that covers these first two. All right. And so, and by that, we mean there will probably be future podcast episodes we do about this very specific issue. And so if you haven't subscribed yet to the podcast, you should. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, you should. If you're not following us on social media, you should, because there's a lot of this stuff happening and there's so much of it that if you're not paying attention, it'll fly under the radar. And we really need people locked in on this stuff, that we need to be moving the needle. Our window of opportunity is short. And so let's re-rig the system to keep our public lands open. And thanks for listening.